Let's travel through another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of secrets. It is a journey into a desert town where in 1947 the ordinary met the extraordinary and left behind questions that refused to die. Let's return to Roswell, here on Things Visible and Invisible. Kevin Randle is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel who served in Vietnam, Iraq, and the Middle East. His interest in UFOs began as a teenager when he investigated a sighting while living in Colorado. Since then, he's investigated hundreds of similar sightings around the US, as well as spending nearly 4 decades researching the events in Roswell. And he joins me down the line from his home in Iowa. Kevin, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Well, thank you very much. Glad to be here again.
Kevin, tonight we're discussing Roswell, the events of Roswell 1947 and the subsequent legacy that has given us. I suppose the first question that comes to mind, is there really anything else we can say about Roswell?
The one thing that comes to my mind is David Rudiak sent out a newspaper clipping that he had found in a Dayton newspaper dated just after the events in Roswell, where it said that the balloon that was supposedly being sent to Wright Field, the special flight had been canceled. And we've argued with skeptics about that for a number of years, and now we have some documented evidence to show that it was so unimportant they didn't even bother sending it to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Wright Field. And that makes you wonder how the fellows in Wright Field were able to identify it as a weather balloon and underscore the inaccuracy of that solution.
Okay, well, that's interesting in itself. But there may be people watching this, Kevin, who are vaguely familiar with Roswell. So what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, is very succinctly, if you can, give us the official version of what happened in Roswell. So the US Air Force and government, what they have said, Roswell, what actually took place in the events of 1947.
I'm not sure we can do this succinctly, given the vast body of evidence. The Air Force investigation, which took place in the mid-1990s, headed by Colonel Richard Weaver, came to the conclusion that what fell at Roswell was a Project Mogul balloon. Project Mogul was a top secret project that was geared to spy on the Soviets using constant level balloons. What was going on in New Mexico, the launch of the balloon arrays to create these constant level balloons, was not classified. The equipment being used was not classified. The local area knew what was going on. That was so unimportant that a number of the balloons launched after the July 4th explanation they didn't even bother to recover them, because a constant level balloon could be used for meteorological research, for example. But they locked on to this and claimed that this highly classified project, the purpose was classified, what was going on in New Mexico was not classified. The Air Force conclusion is, well, we've now explained it as a weather balloon, we can move on from the idea that it was an alien visitation.
Okay. So that's the official version to this day, I presume, Kevin, that it was weather balloons, Project Mogul, and that's the end of the story.
We have to sort of split a fine hair here. The original explanation that came out on July 9th, 1947 was it's just a regular meteorological balloon with a ray wind target attached. Now we move to 1995, and they proposed that it was a Project Mogul balloon array with a radar attached. What we were able to find out was that the launch was canceled, so the balloon launch they claimed was responsible for the debris never happened. We were told that the flight number 4, which was the culprit in this, was configured just like flight number 5, which did launch and did gather data, but it had no ray wind targets. So we're left with this explanation that, well, it was a weather balloon, then it became Project Mogul, which in essence was weather balloons. We have no good terrestrial explanation for what fell at Roswell, which leads toward the extraterrestrial, for example. It doesn't get us all the way there, but it certainly leads in that direction.
Okay. That's interesting. Now, that's the official version, or versions that are slowly coming to the fore. Obviously, there is the famous or infamous, whichever way you want to look at it, press release that came out, which hit the newspapers very, very quickly after the events of what transpired at Roswell. With your sort of hindsight, Kevin, what do you make of that? Was that a botched Air Force press release, or was it deliberate? Was it something that was just genuine, but then was subsequently by people further up began to say, well, we can't say this? What's your take on the information that was released that sort of immediately began to take hold of the media as it was then?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because we're dealing with things that are speculative. I'm not sure exactly what the thinking was at the time. We've questioned why Colonel Blanchard would authorize the press release. But we look at what was going on in 1947. There was an awful lot of interest in flying saucers at the time. And according to Walter Haut, who was the public affairs officer at the time, Blanchard's theory was, we've got an explanation. We can reduce some of the agitation about this flying saucer thing, or what's going on, by releasing this information. And then the next day, or actually 3 hours later, General Ramey at the next higher headquarters said, no, don't worry about it. It's just a weather balloon, and we can move on from there. And that kind of shut off the spigot of information at that time, because reporters couldn't find Jesse Marcel, who was the air intelligence officer, who was, I guess, sort of the main spokesman in this event. The sheriff, when they called the sheriff, he would say, well, I can't talk to you. I'm working with the boys out at the base. The witnesses they would have needed to talk to, the people they would have needed to talk to, were unavailable for them. Blanchard suddenly goes on leave on a Tuesday afternoon, which makes no military sense to me whatsoever. So we have all these things going on. I think that Blanchard ordered the press release because he thought it was the right thing to do at the time. And then it was other organizations, higher organizations, Roswell being the 509th Bomb Group. Its parent organization was the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, and that parent organization was the Strategic Air Command, then based in Washington, D.C. And so I think that the press release came out, and suddenly they had to spin the information because debris had actually been taken to Washington, D.C. on the Sunday before the press release was made. Mac Brazel, who discovered the debris, and I know I'm getting into quite a bit of minutia here, but he found the debris. He took it to the Chaves County Sheriff. Sheriff couldn't identify it. He called out to the base. Marcel, the air intelligence officer, came out. He couldn't identify it. They were ordered to go to Brazel's ranch to see what was going on. They took Sheridan Cavett, a counterintelligence officer. At the same time, Brazel had brought some debris into the sheriff's office. That debris was packaged up and sent on to Fort Worth and then on to Washington, D.C. on a Sunday afternoon. Now the press release comes out on Tuesday afternoon, 48 hours later. And I think that there was some miscommunication at that point. Blanchard thought, we've got an explanation for the flying saucers. We need to let the public know that there's really nothing to it, I suppose, or it's nothing that we need to worry about given the timing of all of this. But once the press release went out, we know it went out at 2:30 Mountain Time, which would have been 1:30, 3:30 in Washington, D.C., for example. And then within 3 hours of that press release being made, we've got the first indications that it was a weather balloon with a Raywin target as opposed to something else.
Why do you think they so quickly were wanting to send this debris to D.C. What do you think was going on there?
It was obvious that what the Brazel had brought into the sheriff's office, which was part of the material found at what we call the debris field, was nothing like he had seen before. He couldn't identify it. He calls out to the base. Jesse Marcel responds to it. He goes to the sheriff's office. He can't identify it. And this is the intelligence officer. He's familiar with what's going on in aviation and that sort of thing. He doesn't know what it is, because it's not what they described as just rubber and strings and balsa wood. It was much stronger and flashier than that. That's why it was sent on to Washington, D.C. So now they're dealing with something they can't identify, and they're hoping by sending it to Washington, D.C., if it's a secret project, they can identify it in Washington, D.C., and they can respond to it in that way. But I think what happened was they couldn't identify it in Washington, D.C., and they tried to shut down the whole investigation, very successfully, I might add, by saying, no, it's just a common weather balloon, and here it is in General Ramey's office. We have 7 photographs of it. But that stuff in Ramey's office, according to Jesse Marcel, was not the stuff he found in Roswell. According to Thomas Dubose, who was the chief of staff of the Air Force in 1947, who's in some of the pictures, said that's not the stuff that they brought. That was the substituted material. So they substituted material. They've shut off the investigation. Reporters can't find Jesse Marcel because he's not in Roswell. He's in Fort Worth. They can't find William Blanchard, the commander, because he's on leave. They talk to the sheriff, and he says, I can't tell you anything. I'm working with the boys out at the base. So the story is nowhere. There's nowhere to go with the story. They can't get to anybody. They've got an explanation that is mundane, and the story moves to other arenas.
Your background obviously is military, and you've also researched many different UFO incidents. I mean, is Roswell a classic case, would you say, Kevin, of how not to communicate something via the military? Because there's one story goes out, a counter story goes out very quickly, and yet there's other things happening in the background. I mean, is this a classic sort of misadventure on the part of the Air Force in terms of trying to communicate something or anything to the media?
Well, look at the way the media works today. How many times have we seen stories retracted? They've always been the idea we have to get there first with the story. And oftentimes they don't care what the truth is, as long as they get out the story first. And I think it's kind of that sort of thing, too. They thought they had an explanation for the flying saucers. They wanted to get it out. But then they realized that they were dealing with something that wasn't as mundane as a weather balloon, and they had no real explanations, and they had to shut it down. And I think we see that all the time in the news media, talking about the very first things they talk about on the news media often is not accurate, and everybody needs to sometimes just take a step back and let the story kind of develop. Check your sources, check the material, make sure it makes sense in that respect. And I think what happened was Blanchard thought it was the right thing to do by announcing they had captured a flying saucer. And in 1947, flying saucer didn't necessarily mean alien spacecraft. It was appended to any anomalous phenomenon you saw in the sky. That became a flying saucer, whether it was a meteor you couldn't identify or a weather balloon, something that you couldn't identify became a flying saucer. As history then worked its way out, we see that flying saucer came to mean alien spacecraft, but in July of 1947, it didn't necessarily mean that. So when they said they have a flying saucer, they were able to kind of retract that statement without looking real bad on it. It says, well, yeah, there was some confusion at the lower headquarters. When it gets to the higher headquarters, we've identified it. There's no story here.
Yeah, given your military experience, do you think that that's credible as an explanation for what happened?
The problem I always have, and I think a lot of people have, including the skeptics, is what possessed Blanchard to issue the press release. All he had to do was not issue the press release. Jesse Marcel was actually in Fort Worth about the time the press release went out. He came back to the base on Tuesday morning. He'd been out at the ranch on Monday, brought material in on Tuesday, and then he was sent off to Fort Worth. So he's no longer there. I think that had they delayed for just several hours, we wouldn't have the story to talk about. We would hear the story from now Jesse Marcel in his 80s, talking about how he had picked up pieces of a flying saucer back in the 1940s. That story wouldn't have gotten any traction. What gave it traction was you go back and you start looking at the newspapers. There's pictures of Jesse Marcel on the front pages of newspapers around the country with this debris. Granted, if you look at the debris and you know what you're doing, it's clearly part of a Raywin target and a weather balloon. But this gives some life to the story. Then I think Stan Friedman called the newspaper in Roswell and asked if there was anybody related to Walter Hott, who issued the press release, the lieutenant who actually took the press release around town, anybody in Roswell who knew who Walter Hott was. And it turned out that Hott's wife worked at the Roswell Daily Record. And so that made the connection. And from that point, as we started looking at the materials, gathering the information, we found witness after witness after witness that talked about some aspect of this. Every member of Colonel Blanchard's staff that we were able to identify or to interview, with one exception, told us basically it was extraterrestrial. The head of the military police on the base, Major Edwin Easley, who retired as Colonel Edwin Easley, told me that he couldn't talk about it. I asked him at one point, are we following the right path? He said, what do you mean? And I said, we think it's extraterrestrial. And he says, well, let me put it this way. It's not the wrong path. And here's a member of Blanchard's staff who was right in the middle of the investigation, telling us basically it's extraterrestrial. Joe Briley, who was the operations officer in 1947, told us that Blanchard's leave was a blind. It was to get him out of the view of the reporters in there. We've talked to any number of the officers who talked about their role in it. We've talked to an awful lot of the enlisted personnel who handled debris. Robert Smith, for example, wasn't out at the debris field, but he was on the base. They were assembling crates to carry the debris off to other places. Talked about how even when they loaded the debris into some of the cases, there was no additional weight. It was so lightweight. One of the sergeants in there happened to have a piece of debris and showed it to him. So we've got evidence from these people. It's not people who came out of the woodwork and said, yes, I was in Roswell in 1947 and this is what I saw. It's people we actively sought out. They made a yearbook in 1947, coincidentally. I think they began it in May of 1947. Walter Hott was responsible for it. There's like 1,500 people who were at the base in June, July of 1947. We've got their pictures, we've got their names, we've got their ranks, and we began looking at those people to see what we could learn from them. I talked to an MP who told me, well, I wasn't involved in this, but all my friends came back and we talked about the story in the newspaper about the flying saucer and got the impression that it wasn't anything usual. It was something extremely unusual. So it's an investigation that took literally years to conduct. A lot of the witnesses did not come forward. We sought them out. Others did come forward and proved to be very valuable. And some of the people who came forward weren't worth very much at all. Were lying to gain their 15 minutes of fame. And we had to make sure that we didn't get fooled. And frankly, we got fooled by a couple of people. But we later learned the truth and were among those who exposed that truth as quickly as we possibly could once we knew the truth. So we've looked at all of this investigative work to understand exactly what happened. And unfortunately, at this point, we have no more firsthand witnesses. I mean, it was 1947. The people would have been at 20 years old in 1947. So you can see where we're going with that. I talked to a guy 12 years ago, 89 years old, sharp as a tack, a low-ranking enlisted man. And he said, well, we're not supposed to talk about it. We were told to forget about it right away. But I mean, ask him questions. He knew what was going on at the base. So it's that kind of thing. We've got an awful lot of data. We're continuing to gather some data. We're looking for records and documentation to underscore the importance of the investigation. But it's now much more difficult because we don't have the eyewitness testimony that we had. And it would have been great if we could have started the investigation in 1947, but neither Don nor I nor Tom Carey were born at that time, so we couldn't do it then. And the information didn't come out until Jesse Marcel spoke to Stan Friedman and Len Springfield in the spring of 1978.
So that's very interesting, Kevin. So talk to me about, I mean, you've been, as I say, researching this for 4 decades. You've talked to many witnesses. You've written about it. You've talked about it on many different platforms. Tell us what really happened at Roswell then, not the official version that we've gone through, which is full of holes and full of problems of one sort or another, people saying one thing, then other people saying something else. Tell us, in your opinion, what really took place at Roswell in 1947?
I think that Tom Carey and Don Schmidt would agree with me. We believe that I believe is too strong of a word. There may have been an alien spacecraft that got into trouble, scattered debris near Corona, New Mexico. That was found by Mac Brazel. Came to rest much closer to Roswell, New Mexico, where the craft and the bodies were located. We were able to find witnesses at both locations. General Arthur Exon, who was base commander at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the 1960s. He was a lieutenant colonel at Wright Field in 1947. So he was there. He told us that he had flown over 2 distinct sites. 2 distinct sites eliminates Project Mogul. At the time he said that, we weren't aware of 2 distinct sites. We just were aware of the debris field. Later on, talking to, it was Master Sergeant, his name was Lewis Rickett, everybody called him Bill Rickett. He was in the counterintelligence office at the time, talked about going from Roswell to the crash site, but said it was only about 45 minutes outside of town. We knew, based on our travels to the debris field, in 1990, it took 3 hours to get there, and the roads were much better. So he was talking about something much closer to Roswell. So we were developing this idea that there were 2 distinct sites, which, by the way, eliminates Mogul, as I think I said. It appears to me what we had was the crash of an extraterrestrial craft. I would like something better than the eyewitness testimony and making that leap of logic. Well, we've eliminated all the terrestrial explanations, therefore it must be extraterrestrial. At this time, I can say with complete confidence, we've eliminated all the terrestrial explanations. The Air Force agreed with us on every one of those except Project Mogul. They selected Project Mogul. We have the documentation to prove that the flight they blame was canceled. It never flew. We're left with no terrestrial explanation. Where do you go from there? I would like to see the president come out and say, yes, we've been hiding this for 80 years. Don't panic. It's been 80 years. Nothing has happened. It's no big problem. Go about your lives the way it is. With the proper documentation, the photographs and that sort of thing, which would be available. But until we get something like that, or we find somebody that has pictures that were taken in 1947. Don and I chased down a guy. We were told a rancher cowboy back in 1947 had taken some pictures of the debris field. And the guy who told us that said, well, I won't tell you his last name, but his first name was Stanton. Coincidentally, like Stanton Friedman, but it wasn't him. We went to the tax assessor's office and asked them, can you sort by first names on the tax records? And they said yes. And they came up with 3 names. 2 of them were businesses and 1 was a guy. We went and visited that guy. Interesting fellow. We had a lovely chat with him. Tried not to direct the conversation. He didn't seem to know what we were talking about. So, we looked for that sort of evidence. I lean toward the extraterrestrial, I guess is the best way to say it, not believe, but I lean toward the extraterrestrial because we've eliminated everything else. But I would like to see some solid empirical evidence of what really happened there. But I lean toward the extraterrestrial, unless the government can come up with something better than Project Mogul, We thought that at one point they may have accidentally dropped an atomic bomb. Back in 1947, the size and shape of the atomic bombs was classified. Roswell was the only place set up to deliver that sort of a munition. The bombs then, I think it was called the MK3. It looked like Fat Man, the one that was one of them those dropped in Japan. We thought, well, they dropped a mock-up somewhere on the ranches back in that time frame, and they covered that up for the obvious reasons. But we couldn't find anything to suggest that. That would be a much better explanation than Project Mogul. But we couldn't find nothing like that. And the Air Force pretty well confirmed all our evidence, everything that we'd found suggesting it wasn't terrestrial manufactured, they agreed with. I have a complete listing of all the missile launches from White Sands, New Mexico, up through, I think, 1957. So I can look at the list so I know what was launched and what happened to it and where it was recovered. Nothing there fell in the proper locations for it to be one of their rockets. Wasn't an experimental aircraft. We couldn't find anything to suggest that. As they say, the Air Force corroborated all that information. So we're left with no terrestrial explanation. I lean toward the extraterrestrial.
Now, one of the features of Roswell, Kevin, which you're well aware of because we've spoken briefly about this before, is that Roswell disappeared. I mean, it may have made the front page with Jesse Marsalis, etc., but it very quickly disappeared and didn't kind of resurface until, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, until the 1980s. In some ways, was it an effective cover-up, if that's what you want to describe it, by the Air Force? Was it something which the government had thought that they'd put a lid on and that was the end of it?
If we look at the history of the information, we, of course, had the information from the newspapers from 1947. It's a flying saucer. No, it's not. It's a balloon. Periodically, we would find things mentioning it. Frank Edwards, I think, in his book Flying Saucers, Serious Business, had a chapter, I think it's chapter 4, about pieces of picking up the pieces, I think it was called. And the first story in that is basically Roswell. He's got almost everything wrong other than the name of the place. But that was 1966. We found references to it up until Jesse Marcel came out. There was a report done on the wave of 1947, meaning that somebody got a compendium of all the flying saucer stories, UFO stories from 1947. Roswell appears in there, but it's labeled as one of the hoaxes. Wasn't really a hoax if you wanted to go that direction, misidentification. There were rare mentions of it. Most of the information was wrong. Most everybody ignored it, especially after the Aztec crash from 1948 made big news in 1950 with Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers, and the evidence presented in the book, and the two alleged scientists who were involved in it turned out to be con men and like that. In the UFO community, there was a great deal of resistance to any idea of a UFO crash. Official UFO magazine, for example, in that time frame, did a story that the Aztec crash was a hoax. On the other side of the coin, a guy named Robert Carr, who was a professor, I think, at a community college in Florida, came out and said he had talked to 5 people and that Aztec was real. If he talked to anybody who thought it was real, I'm assuming now he assumed it was Aztec when they might have been talking to Roswell. Point simply is, once the Aztec story was thoroughly destroyed in the media by reporting, J.P. Kane did something in the San Francisco Chronicle, for example. True Magazine had a big expose in their, I think, a 1952 issue of the magazine. UFO researchers stayed away from any story of a crash until Len Stringfield started gathering that material. And there was a great deal of material to be gathered, not just about Roswell, but crashes that go back into the our prehistories almost, back into the 1897 airship stories and some other crashes that took place up to the point of Roswell, and then, of course, lots of crashes afterwards. So Len was gathering those stories Most of them turned out to have terrestrial explanations, and we could ignore them. But it so hid everything that UFO researchers. I know when I was first heard about Roswell, and it would have been 1986, 1987. I'd seen the book, The Roswell Incident, when it came out. I think it came out in 1980. And I thought, well, this is just the Aztec case repackaged, and paid no attention to it. Once I was invited into the Center for UFO Studies investigation about the Roswell case, and I was invited in because of a military background. A lot of the witnesses had military backgrounds, and they thought I would be able to establish a rapport with them that maybe a civilian researcher wouldn't be able to do. I was brought into it. Don Schmidt and I went to Roswell, thoroughly convinced we would spend 2 or 3 days down there, and we would find an explanation. As Don said in the Netflix documentary, we were wrong. And that's true. I remember as we were going back to the airport after we had finished the investigation that first time, I said, Don, we got to come back, because we hadn't gotten everything. We had not had real good luck until we got to Bill Brazel. And here was a guy who also handled the debris. He was the son of the man who found it. So we got a good analysis from him of what happened. And we said, we got to come back. And then we were gathering other witnesses. We talked to the family of the sheriff, for example. One of the daughters, Phyllis McGuire, had been in the sheriff's office when Brazel brought into the debris. And you have to remember, back in 1947, the sheriff's family lived above the sheriff's office. So the wife was sort of the matron of the jail, if there were female prisoners, and the family was all there. They chased her out after Marcel showed up, but she was able to give us an idea of what was going on at that time. So we look at all of that sort of thing. I started the investigation in talking to Don about it in late 1988, and then we made our first trip to Roswell in February of 1990 and 1989. Talked to Bill Brazel in a restaurant in Carrizosa, New Mexico, and he gave us all the information we wanted. Neat aside, we came back, and he told us that he had told his wife, well, if I like those guys, I'll help them out. If I don't, I'll just ignore them. We came back, and we were going to go to the debris. He was going to show us where the debris field was. He was going to take us out to the debris field. And we get into his pickup truck. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. We're driving across country. And he says, you boys want a beer? And Don says, well, I don't drink. And I thought, well, somebody ought to drink a beer with him. I'm just really not thrilled with beer at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so I drank a beer with Bill Brazel. He took us out to the debris field and showed it where it was. One other aside, which has got nothing to do with this, the history of Lincoln County. At the time, Roswell was Lincoln County. Then it became Chavez County at some point. There was, I've lost my train of thought now. Okay, Chavez County. Oh, well, the Brazel family goes back a long ways in the history of that area of New Mexico. And if you read books about the Lincoln County War, Billy the Kid and that sort of thing, they talk about Pat McGarrett and all of this sort of thing. And Pat McGarrett was killed by Wayne. I'm just really getting tongue-tied here for something. He was killed by Wayne Brazel in 1908 near Alamogordo, New Mexico. And in these books, they say, well, Wayne Brazel disappeared from sight, and we don't know what happened to him. So we're driving across New Mexico, drinking the warm beer. And I said to Bill Brazel, what do you know about Wayne Brazel? He said, well, that was my uncle. And I said, I hear he disappeared. Nah, he lived in Arizona. We went and visited him in Arizona all the time. The deal was when he was acquitted of the murder of Pat Garrett, he had to get out of the New Mexico territory. He went and lived in Arizona. I'm trying to figure out why these historians could never get that information, because the Brazels are all over New Mexico. And I got it with one simple question, but I digress.
So the other question then, which you must have pondered, Kevin, is that if what happened in Roswell in what you're suggesting, that there was a crash of some sort and then a massive cover-up, and I know you've been involved with other cases, is this a recurring pattern, do you see, that there is crash or phenomena of some sort, and then government cover up. Is this the pattern that you have seen for the last 50, 60, 70 years?
Well, I think you've asked a bunch of questions there. I've done a couple of books on UFO crashes, the last one being Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky. Somebody else counted it. There's 118 alleged crashes in there. I think you can reduce it to a handful, and that's stretching it a little bit. I think that if you've developed a way of traveling interstellar distances, your technology is to the point where you're not going to be falling out of the sky where it's alleged. I think there was just a couple of things that happened. There was the Shag Harbor case in 1968, which I think of as more of an emergency landing. Chris Stiles and Don Ledger have done a masterful job of gathering documentation and eyewitness testimony up there in Canada, showing that something really anomalous happened. In fact, they even have a picture of the object in the sky. I did a book called The Randle Report, and in it I actually print the picture of this object in the sky, with their permission, I might add. But I think that when you look at the totality of UFO cases, there are very few legitimate crashes. Roswell being one, I think Shag Harbor would be one. I go back and forth on Kecksburg. I know Stan Gordon very well, and I'm pretty well convinced that may have been meteoric in origin as opposed to alien. But there really aren't very many good one of those. If you move it to the realm of other spectacular UFO sightings, then yeah, we got a bunch of them. I think of Levelland back in November of 1957, Levelland being near Lubbock, Texas, if that helps you find it on a map. It's about a 3-hour drive from Levelland to Roswell. I know because I've made the drive a couple of times. But this was a case in which a UFO was seen over a period of about 3 or 4 hours. As it approached cars, their engines would die, the lights would go out, the radios would fill with static, or they would die. The sheriff, when I hate his name, Weir Clem, talk about a hillbilly name, but he said he reported a number of times that he had gotten literally hundreds of calls about this UFO. What I found out is during that activity on November 2nd, late at night, he decided he was going to go out to search for the object because there had been so many reports. If you look at the newspaper reports and the Project Blue Book file on it, he's interviewed in there. He says, well, you saw a red streak in the distance, but he didn't get very close to it. If you look at the newspaper reports that came out prior to the Air Force investigation, this was a Saturday night, Sunday, I believe, or Friday night and Saturday. The Air Force investigation got there on a Tuesday. He spent almost 8 hours there investigating it and then left with a cockamamie explanation. But in that time, the sheriff was interviewed by a number of reporters, and he told them that he had gone out and there was a deputy in the car with him. Behind him was a car from the Texas Department of Public Safety, which thinks state police there. Behind them was a car from the Air Force with Air Force officers in it. And you take a look at that, it means they were out looking for the thing, and the sheriff described the object as football-shaped or oval-shaped. They got close enough to see a shape, actually.
Right.
The sheriff the next day went to the police mechanic and asked him to check out the car. Why would he do that? Because his car stalled. And if his car stalled, the car behind him stalled, and the car with the Air Force officers stalled. I have never been able to find the Air Force officers. But that's a very good case. The case boiled down to the Air Force saying there are only 3 witnesses to the craft. Don Kehoe, who was the head of the director of NICAP, the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which is a civilian research organization, said there were 9 witnesses. If you go to the Air Force files, I can find the names of 13. And the sheriff talked about hundreds. You go through newspaper files and all of that, you can find many, many names of witnesses to this object. There was even the story of landing traces. So what you have on Levelland is multiple multiple witnesses to a phenomenon. It interferes with the environment, stalling the car engines, and you have a landing trace where the object actually touched down and left a burned area. You've got multiple chains of evidence. You've got reliable witnesses, and when you get to the newspaper articles and everything, it boils down to how many witnesses saw the craft, not what the evidence was. So you look at the Air Force file, the sheriff says he saw a streak of light in the distance. Don Berliner interviewed him in 1975, again in an official UFO magazine. And the editor of that, Bernie O'Connor, produced a wonderful, wonderful book about the first issues of official UFOs, coming out with the second one. So some of those articles are now going to be available in a really nice book form. But Berliner interviewed the sheriff again, and the sheriff was back to talking about how he got close enough to see the shape of the object. The Air Force explanation was it's ball lightning. Ball lightning, 18 inches in diameter, never been told to stall a car, lasts minutes at the most. And we've got a phenomenon that lasted 2 to 3, 4 hours, stalling car engines all over the Texas Panhandle.
Amazing.
Very good case. We talked about the Socorro case, which we've often said, well, it boils down to a single witness, a police officer. Turns out that's not true. We found additional witnesses telling us the story. We've even exposed some of the people who made up their versions of the story. Very good case. Landing traces. The Air Force investigator on that, the chief of Project Blue at the time, Hector Quintanilla, said that in his book, which was not published, some of us were able to get the draft copies of it, said of that case, he had no explanation for it, didn't know what it was. He was sure that the explanation was hidden in Lonnie Zamora's head, meaning Lonnie Zamora being the police officer. Zamora had seen something that would have explained it, but somehow that never came out. So we've got just very good cases like that all through the history of ufology. Multiple witness cases, literally dozens of witnesses, landing traces, photographs, movie footage, radar tracks, and yet the Air Force, the military, the government did such a good job in 1947 of convincing us that there was nothing to this, that only drunks and low IQ people see these things. In fact, the headline in, I think it was a Kansas City newspaper, said, flying saucers seen in 38 states except Kansas. At the time, Kansas was a dry state. You couldn't buy a legal drink in Kansas. So there were no drunks in Kansas to see the flying saucers. And that curtain of ridicule has persisted to the point where people were afraid to tell anybody they had seen flying saucers or UFOs for fear of ridicule. If you look at the newspaper stories or the media stories that came out, oftentimes they're reported tongue-in-cheek by reporters who clearly don't believe there's flying saucers, but here's what the people told us. And you look at those stories in depth, and some of those stories are very, very good. So we've got a wide body of multiple chains of evidence that they've been able to keep under wraps for years and years and years. And we're still having that problem. Just recently, I reported on Coast to Coast AM just a couple of weeks ago about how they have been able to look at the UAP phenomenon now, come up with explanations for most of the cases. Sean Kirkpatrick said that they looked at these cases. There's nothing to suggest alien visitation. That was just weeks ago. And that some of the cases they couldn't talk about because of national security. Same excuses they've been using since 1947.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely fascinating, Kevin. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time together. Tell people where they can find out more about you and your various researches, and also pick up a copy of one of your many books.
Well, of course, everything's available at Amazon. As look at Kevin D. Randle, and you'll find the UFO books. I do a blog, kevinrandle.blogspot.com. I think there's about 1,500 articles on there that you can take a look at with lots of pictures and things like that. The UFO books, like I said, are available at Amazon.com. For those of interested in my military background, I did a series of books called Vietnam Ground Zero, which are fictional accounts, but a lot of them, the material in there are from my experiences in Vietnam under the pen name Eric Helm. So take a look for Eric Helm, and buy an Eric Helm book or two and help me out a little bit. But I'll be in Roswell, I guess, this summer to talk about Roswell, obviously, and in October I'll be in Nova Scotia at their big UFO symposium there to talk about UFOs in general. I think what I'll be talking about is what I call chasing footnotes, where we have a story that's been published a number of times, and I try to get back to the original source and find out, is this story good, or has it been added to or evolved in the retelling through other books and things like that. So I'll be doing that as well.
Okay, for now, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.